In 1960s South Africa, a pencil could decide whether you were black or white. Here's how. A clerk sat you down, took a pencil, pushed it into your hair. If it fell out, white. If it stayed, something else. Different laws, where you could live, whom you could marry, what school your kids attended. This was real. Government policy. 1948 to the early 1990s. They called it Apartheid. They were proud of it. In 1984 alone, this system reclassified 795 people. 518 went from coloured to white. 2, on paper, became Chinese. How do you build something like that? How do you take it apart? Apartheid wasn't a mob. It wasn't a dictator. It was a civil service. Picture a man in a suit. Government office in Pretoria, 9 in the morning. Coffee, forms, lunch, more forms. Home to a wife and 2 kids who ask how his day was. He says, fine, sleeps soundly. The next morning, on the strength of one of his signatures, 60,000 people are told to pack and get on a truck. Mothers wake their children, grandparents sit on suitcases. By nightfall, the houses they grew up in are rubble. 1948, the year apartheid got its name, isn't the beginning. It's the middle. The sorting had been going on quietly for 3 centuries. The first Dutch ships landed at the Cape of Good Hope in April 1652. They weren't there to colonize anything. They were there for vegetables. Yes, vegetables. Here's why. The Dutch East India Company ran the spice trade between Amsterdam and Indonesia. Sailors kept dying of scurvy on the voyage. They needed a halfway stop. So the story of apartheid begins with cabbages. Within a couple of generations, the trading post had become something else. Slaves came in from Madagascar and Mozambique. By the late 1700s, more enslaved people at the Cape than free white settlers. The Khoikhoi were driven off their land. Smallpox finished what the muskets started. Laws began. Who could go where, own what, marry whom. The British took over in the 1800s and grew the system around mining. Then 1913 happened. A single law, the Natives' Land Act, drew a map. The native population could only own land inside designated reserves. Those reserves, about 7% of the country. The other 93%, white ownership only. The majority of the country restricted by law to 7% of it. In 1913, 35 years before the word apartheid even existed, black families who'd been farming white-owned land for generations were thrown off, overnight. The journalist Sol Plaatje walked across the country to document it. He called it the moment a man could wake up to find himself a pariah in the land of his birth. By the 1940s, this wasn't controversial. It was just how things worked. The political argument wasn't whether to fix the system. It was whether to fine-tune it. In 1948, the National Party ran on fine-tuning. They called their program Apartheid, Afrikaans for separateness. They won. Their plan sought every person in the country by race. Same central government, different rights. Different schools, different futures. Just one problem. How do you decide who's in which box? Starting in 1950, the answer was the Population Registration Act. Every person classified into 4 groups. White, black, coloured, mixed ancestry, Indian, mostly descendants of South Asian labourers. There was just one problem. People don't come pre-labelled. They have faces, ancestries, family histories that don't sort neatly. So the clerks made it up. There were tests, the pencil test, hair texture, eye colour, the skin behind your knees, yes, actual government procedure. And tribunals, where your race could be decided in an afternoon by a bureaucrat who had never met you. Consider Sandra Lang. Sandra was born in 1955 to 2 white Afrikaner parents, just happened to be darker than them. When Sandra was 10, white parents at her school complained. A police officer showed up. The state reclassified her as coloured. Her parents fought it for years. They lost in court, but kept pushing. Eventually, Parliament had to amend the law just to make her reclassification possible. But the story didn't end there. As an adult, Sandra married a black man. They had kids. White women couldn't legally raise non-white children, so Sandra had to apply to be reclassified coloured again, just to keep her own kids. One person, 3 different races, and thousands of stories like hers. Once classification was sorted, the state moved on to where you could live. If your race didn't match the zoning of your neighborhood, you moved. The Group Areas Act of 1950 made it law. In Cape Town, District 6 was the most ambitious target. 60,000 people of every background, coloured, black, Indian, white, living together for over a century. Mosques next to churches. A working-class neighbourhood that had been there since the 1860s. In 1966, the state declared the whole place white. Imagine the trucks coming up your street. Your neighbours are loaded onto them, furniture, kids, kitchen tables, and driven away. Then it's your turn. You pack what you can carry. You're driven 30 kilometres out of the city to a township where the state has built nothing. No schools, no shops, no public transport. Just rows of identical concrete boxes on a windswept plain. Behind you, the bulldozers move in. For decades after, most of the cleared land in District 6 stayed empty. The state had spent enormous resources to remove 60,000 people from a piece of ground it never rebuilt. Just rubble and weeds where the neighbourhood had been. 3.5 million South Africans went through some version of this story between 1960 and the early 1980s. Where you lived was settled. Next, what your children could learn. The Bantu Education Act made school a tool of labour preparation. Hendrik Verwoerd, the minister behind it, told Parliament black children had no place, and I'm quoting, above the level of certain forms of labour. Black schools ran 60 kids to a teacher, with old textbooks or none. Higher math, sciences, anything outside the labour track was quietly stripped from the curriculum. A whole generation passed through classrooms designed not to educate them. Many came out unable to read. Schools were settled. Next, where you could go. The pass laws required you, by 16, to carry a passbook documenting your race, your employer, and the precise places you were allowed to be. A police officer could stop you on any street and demand it. Over the Apartheid era, this system produced more than 17 million arrests. Workers torn from families, mothers from children. Movement was settled. Next, citizenship itself. By the 1970s, the Bantu Homelands Policy declared you weren't a South African citizen at all. You were a citizen of one of 10 so-called homelands, patchwork rural territories that together covered 13% of the country. Imagine opening your passbook one morning and finding your citizenship had been changed to a place you couldn't point to on a map. Most homelands were barren, no electricity, no industry, no jobs. Bare ground, kept that way on purpose, to keep their populations as cheap migrant labour for the white cities. The country you'd been born in had, on paper, become a foreign one. Each layer built on the last. Where you could be, whom you could marry, what your children could learn, what hospital could treat you. Each piece, its own ministry, its own paperwork, its own filing cabinet. For nearly 2 decades this machine ran, but machines like that don't run forever. Systems like that generate their own opposition. By the early 1960s, the opposition was organised. The African National Congress and a breakaway group called the Pan-Africanist Congress were running civil disobedience, mostly non-violent, mostly aimed at the pass laws. Then came Sharpeville. On the 21st of March 1960, 5,000 people gathered outside a police station in the township of Sharpeville. The plan was simple: hand themselves in without their passbooks, until the system ran out of space to hold them. Mass arrest as protest. Many had brought their children. They sang, they prayed, they waited. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, with no warning, the police opened fire. They kept firing. 1,344 rounds. 69 people killed, many shot in the back as they tried to run. Among the dead, women and children. The government banned both organisations the next month. Mandela went underground. Armed resistance began. 2 years later, Mandela was caught. At his trial, the prosecution sought the death penalty. He addressed the court directly. He had cherished, he said, the ideal of a South Africa where everyone lived as equals. An ideal he was prepared to die for. He didn't get death, he got life. 45 years old when the cell door on Robben Island closed behind him. While he was inside, his mother died. So did his eldest son. He was denied permission to attend either funeral. The filing cabinets, meanwhile, kept filling up. 16 years later, the morning of the 16th of June 1976, thousands of schoolchildren in Soweto walked out of class and started marching. They were protesting a new rule, forcing half their school subjects to be taught in Afrikaans. The language, as they put it, of the people oppressing them. The march was peaceful. The police met it with live ammunition. By nightfall, 23 people were dead in Soweto. The uprising would spread. Over the months that followed, more than 500 people died across the country. But the moment that made the world look was from that first day. A 12-year-old boy named Hector Peterson had walked out of his school that morning to support the older students' march. A police bullet hit him before noon. An older student picked him up and ran toward a car that could take him to a hospital. Hector's 17-year-old sister ran alongside, weeping. A photographer named Sam Nzima happened to be there. He took a picture. That picture went around the world. For the first time, the world saw what apartheid looked like up close. And the world started to push back. UN mandatory arms embargo. Olympic ban for South African athletes. Rugby and cricket, both national obsessions, frozen out of international play. Foreign companies pulled out. Barclays, Coca-Cola, IBM. In 1986, the US Congress passed sweeping economic sanctions over a presidential veto. Inside the country, the 1980s were grim. Funerals turning into rallies, burning barricades. The state spending more and more of its budget just to keep the lid on. A country that had spent decades trying to be seen as part of the West was now a pariah. Then, in a moment almost no one had expected, the lid came off. On the 2nd of February 1990, State President F.W. de Klerk stood up in Parliament and unbanned everything. The ANC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Communist Party. 9 days later, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. After 27 years and 6 months. At 71. He could have called for revenge. He didn't. He called for negotiation. 4 bruising years of that followed. On the 27th of April, 1994, for the first time in the country's history, every adult South African could vote. The queues stretched for miles. Some waited 3 days. The ANC won. Mandela was sworn in as president. The machine was dismantled over the following years. But here's what's haunting. A country shaped by a century of that machinery doesn't change shape overnight. The wealthiest suburbs are still, overwhelmingly, the ones that used to be designated white. The poorest townships are still the ones the Group Areas Act built. Sandra Lang is still alive. She has spoken about her experience over the years to documentary filmmakers, journalists, anyone who comes asking. What she tends to return to when she talks isn't politics. It's the simpler thing underneath. She just wanted, she says, to be with her family.